Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Unleash Your Life Force. I am your host, Dr. Natasha Nelson. And as we start this new year, it had been in the works, but it took me a moment to get it going, which is really about the somatic healing and the emotional connection to our body and the mind body connection. We hear so much about it. So each week, I will bring to you one body part, one emotion, one something to help you understand what is somatic healing and how it works with the body and how our emotions, but really giving you the practical tools about how to heal, what to do with it, how to actually incorporate that into your day-to-day life. So today I want to talk about grief and the overlooked aspect about how grief plays a role on our health. And I want to start with understanding what grief actually is. We hear the words, but what is grief? So grief is it's a profound loss. And we can think about loss of, family or friends or people. But this is also any loss that is so profound to each individual person. It can be the loss of, like we're experiencing in LA, homes. It could be pets. But people don't understand that the grieving process also can be attributed to the loss of what we value. It can be the loss of connections that we have. It could be the loss of our community. Loss can be anything that is deeply held to the individual person. So it can be your community, it could be your business, it could be your job. People don't understand that even if it's a job or a business that you're happy to, leave or get rid of, there's the loss of the people and the connections that you had in it. But it's also the loss of identity that can go with it. Think about the loss of a dream, the loss of, if you feel like loss of a sense of purpose or meaning. This is also the loss of trust. What happens when you've been betrayed and trust has been violated? There could be a sense of the grief that goes with that loss. So it's easy to think about just the obvious of loss of people and places and things, but there's so much more to grief. And the reason I bring that up is maybe it's you that's experiencing grief, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is that you are grieving. But it's also a reminder that other people may be grieving for something that they may not be able to clearly articulate. They may not understand it. They may not be able to tell you what it is that they are feeling the loss of. So this is to help you understand what they may be going through and how to help and support them. And so when we look at grief, there are so many layers to grief. And so when you understand that grief is a loss, and we can understand the emotion of loss, but how does that actually play a role on our physical health? That's where oftentimes the connection of, well, how does the emotion affect our health? How does that actually happen? And that's what I want to help you understand. And so when grief, first parts of grief is first you have to get through the trauma. You have to survive something that's traumatic. You can't necessarily process grief while you're still trying to survive, but it's afterwards. Once the traumatic event or circumstance or situation has settled, once your physical survival has been stabilized, Then the grief is the emotion of what's left. And grief, when you're not sure how to deal with loss, the emotions that of loss, when it's not completely felt through the body, will get stuck in the body. Because emotions is energy in motion. That's what an emotion is. So feelings is what you feel. The emotion is the chemistry in the body. And if you don't release it, it will get stuck in the body. And every emotion has certain places in the body that tends to be the place it has an affinity for. And the body, just like the car dash, can tell you what's going on based on symptoms and signals and signs that the physical body is giving you. And so grief, when it's not processed properly or completely, then when it's incomplete, that energy will get stuck and housed in the lungs. And how that works is it's the lungs, but it's really the diaphragm. The muscle of the diaphragm is what allows the lungs to function. So when the diaphragm contracts, just like any muscle in the body, when you contract the diaphragm, it pulls down and it pulls the lungs, which creates a void, which brings oxygen into the lungs. And then the diaphragm will push the carbon dioxide out. And it's that exchange of oxygen that's happening in the lungs that where grief can get stuck. So I want you to think a little bit about the lungs. What's the function of the lungs? What do the lungs do? It's this place where oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide goes out, but it's the exchange. It's the exchange of our life force, because that's what oxygen is. It's the life force of the body, along with the blood, which is a different episode, but connected here. That oxygen circulates. Oxygen feeds every cell of every tissue and organ in the body. You need oxygen in every cell for the cell to function. Part of what the function of every cell is you get byproduct of oxygen allows for function of the cell, and then you have carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and toxins of what the body gets rid of. So it's this connection and exchange with nature that is the foundational principle of life. And so our life force. And so grief, when grief is not processed fully and completely, we feel it in our chest. We feel it in our lungs. That's why you can have symptoms where the grief and trauma can feel so intense and so overwhelming, it catches your breath. It affects your breath, right? We hear it saying, I can't take a deep breath, or I feel it in my chest, like the pressure on the chest. It's really the pressure on the lungs, where the lungs can't fully inhale and expand and contract, and this constant interaction with nature. The lungs and the purpose, that's what allows you to start to think about, oh, how grief interferes with the physical health and how the mind-body connection actually happens. So when trauma happens and something traumatic and scary, and we're not sure of our survival, and there's grief about the loss, because remember, loss and grief can also be related to the loss of our sense of security. When we feel our safety, our security, our comfort, when those are gone, there's a loss with that. And that, when we don't really understand it, it impacts how we can, our ability to exhale. Because our ability to exhale is part of letting go. It's part of feeling safe and secure and comfortable to just be at ease. And so when you recognize that grief, gosh, there are so many layers. And in fact, so many impacts of, just our life and what's happening. But it's where and how the mind feels grief, for how it understands grief and processes grief, which is loss. And so we can have symptoms about grief, which is, difficulty breathing or trouble taking in a deep, full breath or exhaling completely. It catches our breath, which is why when we feel triggered, it can catch our breath and stop us in our breath. Any other symptoms can also really be any of the unhealthy behaviors that we use to cope, to hide trauma or to avoid discomfort. Any of those things and the coping behaviors are also part of it, but that can be applied to everything. So I'm not going to go in detail here because today it's really about grief and it's about the lungs. And so the part that we overlook on what to do and how to really process grief and get to the point of completion, not because it's done, that we forget, not because we move on, but the first step in dealing with grief is really about acceptance. And it's such a big word, the word acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean you like it. It doesn't mean you want it. Acceptance means you start with acknowledging what's truly there and what's been lost. And the ability to accept what's been lost is the first step to acknowledge what matters to you, what held value, what was important. And oftentimes we seem to diminish the things that are important to us by overlooking that there was a value, that they mattered. We think, oh, it's no big deal, it's not that important, or worse, oh, I shouldn't have cared so much, or it's not as big of a deal what other people are going through. All of those things diminish the truth of what you are feeling and the truth of what matters to you, which is it mattered. There was something that mattered to you, something that was valuable, that was important, and is now gone. And the loss is important to acknowledge that something, whether it was taken from you, whether you gave it away not unknowingly, whatever, it doesn't matter. The loss means it's no longer there. Oftentimes with grief, there is an association of guilt and shame. And those are a lot deeper, and I'll talk about that. I'll do a separate episode because there's a lot of energy surrounding those emotions. But they are tied with grief because oftentimes when there's a loss, we also feel a sense of blame or shame or guilt that we did not see it coming, or we didn't stop it from happening, or that we should have known better. All of those can be tied to the sense of guilt, a sense of shame. But today is really about recognizing grief, because grief is real. And grief, if we don't feel the feelings of grief, and if we don't feel them all the way through to the end, the emotions, the energy of grief will become trapped in our body, trapped in our physical body, which now will compromise our health, compromises the lungs, but it compromises every part of the body if we don't get oxygen at full amount to every cell in the body. So that is how the mind-body connection works. That is how emotions, when they are left unprocessed and we don't deal with them and we don't feel them and we don't address them, they drain the energy from our body. They compromise our health. They leave us just in a place where we are more likely to be injured, where health, our immune system is not as strong as it could be. Everything becomes affected. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, was understanding the connection of grief, how it shows up in the lungs, and how the first part of grief is acknowledging and accepting the what is actually happening, to start there. There's so much about grief, and there's so much more than what I can do here. But really, when you think about grief, it's the deep, deep part of our soul. It's the soul, our soul guiding us to what hurts. It is guiding us about what matters to us. And if we lean into that grief, what it does is it will force us to get really clear on our values, our core values, the heart and soul of who we are, of what matters. Grief about, loss. It's easy to feel like we just want to close up and shut down and withdraw, because grief can hurt so much. But at the root, when we realize grief is letting us know the depths of how much we love, what we love, what we loved, something that mattered so much is no longer there. But really, it may not be there physically, but at whatever it is or whoever it is that we love so dearly, so deeply, so intensely, while they may not be physically with us, they are not gone. They are with us in our heart. Part of what hurts so much with grief is when we have all of this love in our heart that we want to pour on the people or the places or the things or whatever it is of our life. We're pouring our heart and our soul on what we love. And when that is no longer there, it feels like our love has nowhere to go. It feels like our heart, everything about who we are, has nowhere to go, has nowhere to flow. The life force of love, the life force of who we are, has nowhere to land. And that can feel so painful. But when you understand grief in those terms, it can make, we understand why we may not want to feel that kind of pain, and why we shut down and feel like, well, I don't want to love like that anymore. I don't want to feel connected to a person or a place or a thing or a job or anything that can be taken away. Ultimately, what that does is it hurts us deeply in the core of who we are, because we are meant to love. We are meant to feel. We are meant to allow the love that we have to flow out from us onto whatever it is we are showering with love. And it's having no place to let that go that can feel intense and cause that grief to hurt. And it's the pain that makes us want to stop loving or shut down or disconnect and withdraw. And what I'm saying is, part of the healing process and dealing with grief is allowing yourself to feel what hurts, to feel the pain, and to feel it all the way through, knowing, as the quotes that we hear, I don't know who the author of the quote is, but grief is the price that we pay for love. And it hurts. It hurts when it's gone, but the love that we have is not gone. And part of the healing process is finding other places for our love to flow. So maybe it's a plant, maybe it's a pet, maybe it's a creative expression of writing or music or talking to somebody. Any other way that we can allow our love to flow is what's going to allow the healing process in our physical body and the emotional well-being of who we are as emotional beings. And that's what grief is here to teach us, that it's worth it. It hurts, but it's worth it. And if we don't allow ourselves to love and to acknowledge that grief is part of the deal, we'll feel it in our lungs and it'll hurt and cause the physical symptoms associated with the lungs. So I know that there's a lot of information, a lot of layers to grief, the somatic healing of grief, how it shows up in the lungs, that it's really here to teach us about allowing the life force to flow, oxygen to flow, acceptance for life and how it is. Doesn't mean you stay stuck there. It just means you have to acknowledge where you're at in current time, in the moment. And so that's today's lesson. And so really my intention for today was to help you understand the layers of grief that you might be going through that you didn't know the depth that was there, but also to understand what somebody else may be experiencing. And each week I'll bring a different body part, I'll bring a different emotion, but I want to hear from you. Leave me a comment or email me or connect with me, because I want to hear how this relates with you, if it resonates with you, questions that you may have. Because ultimately, my work as a somatic healer is to teach you how to feel your feelings so your body doesn't feel them for you. So that's today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you. And so thank you for supporting the work that I do. Yeah, I think that's it for today. Until next time, it's always about unleashing the life force and being present and connecting with who you are and all of the love that you have to share, and just connecting with yourself and other people. So thank you. I'm Dr. Natasha Nelson, your life doctor, and I'll see you next time.